October 8th, 1943. Somewhere beneath the frozen hills of Upper Silesia, a man pressed his back against a coal-black wall and listened to 23 armed soldiers walk straight into his trap. He didn't carry a rifle. He carried a pickaxe, a coil of rope, and 40 years of knowing exactly how a mountain breathes and how to make it stop. His name was Thomas Robel, a coal miner, a father, a man the SS never thought to fear. They were wrong. In the months that followed this single night, German military reports would describe what happened in the tunnels beneath Grzybów Hill as an unexplained structural catastrophe. The truth, buried deeper than the rubble itself, was far simpler. A miner had studied the mountain his entire life, and when the moment came, he used everything it had ever taught him. This is his story. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll. Type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. Silesia in the autumn of 1943 smelled like coal dust and wet pine, and underneath everything, fear. It had smelled that way for 4 years. The occupation had come to Upper Silesia swiftly in September of 1939, and the Germans had wasted no time converting the region into what they privately called the engine room of the Reich. The coal mines, enormous, ancient, sprawling beneath the hills like buried cities, were too valuable to destroy and too essential to abandon. The Germans needed them running. They needed the men inside them alive, at least until the ore ran out. Thomas Robel had descended into the Grzybów mine for the first time at the age of 14, following his father's lamp through a shaft so narrow that both of them had to walk sideways. Now, at 51, his hands were the color of the coal he'd spent a lifetime pulling out of the earth. His shoulders were bent slightly forward, not from age, but from 4 decades of ducking beneath low ceilings. His eyes, pale gray and quiet, had adjusted long ago to seeing in almost total darkness. He was not a violent man by nature. He was a man who understood weight, who knew by instinct and mathematics and a kind of hard-earned intuition that no textbook had ever articulated, exactly how much pressure a support beam could bear before the mountain reclaimed what it had always owned. His wife Marta had been taken in the spring of 1942, a roundup, the kind the Germans announced without apology, selecting names from lists compiled by administrators in offices that smelled of cigarettes and bureaucratic efficiency. She had been transported east. The reports that filtered back through the partisan networks in the following weeks, whispered in back rooms and beneath bridges, were not hopeful. Thomas had listened to those reports with the same stillness he brought to everything else. Then he had gone back to work. Some men broke under grief. Thomas calcified. He became, to the German mine administrators who relied on him, a model worker, reliable, quiet, technically indispensable. He knew every tunnel in the Grzybów system, the active shafts, the sealed ones, the half-forgotten lateral passages that the pre-war company had mapped and then abandoned when the coal ran thin. He had kept his own maps, hand-drawn on strips of paper he stored inside the false bottom of a tin toolbox that sat, unremarkably, beneath his bunk. He had also, by the summer of 1942, made contact with a partisan cell operating out of the forested hills east of town. They called themselves the Szare Szeregi, the Grey Ranks, though this particular group was a loose affiliate rather than a formal brigade. There were 11 of them: farmers, a schoolteacher, a former railway engineer, 2 university students who had never finished their degrees. They had weapons but limited ammunition. They had courage but limited strategy. What they lacked, more than anything, was someone who understood the terrain in 3 dimensions. Thomas brought them maps. Then he brought them maps. Then he brought them plans. Then, slowly, carefully, as the winter of 1942 deepened and the German patrols grew more aggressive in the hills around Grzybów, he began to teach them how to move underground. Not through the active shafts, those were monitored, lit, patrolled by guards who kept rosters of every worker who entered and exited. Through the forgotten ones, the tunnels the mountain had half swallowed back, the passages that existed in the official registry only as sealed and defunct, the ones that only Thomas Robel could navigate without a map, because the map had always lived perfectly intact inside his head. He called them the Grey Roads. The partisans learned to walk them in silence, following the faint yellow glow of his lamp and the sound of his boots ahead. They would need every inch of that knowledge before October was through. The first operation had nothing to do with tunnels. In February of 1943, a German supply convoy, 4 trucks carrying engine parts and ammunition, was scheduled to pass through the valley road below Grzybów on a Tuesday night. The road curved sharply at the base of a granite outcropping the locals called Czarny Nos, Black Nose, where the rock face jutted close to the shoulder. Tomasz had studied that curve for weeks. He brought the partisan group's youngest member, a 19-year-old named Piotr, who had worked briefly as a mechanic before the war, to look at the rock face with him one afternoon in January. They stood there in the cold, like 2 men out for a walk, which was precisely what they were in the eyes of anyone watching. There, Tomasz said, pointing at a narrow seam of compressed earth that ran horizontally through the granite about 4 meters above the road. It looked like nothing, a geological imperfection. Piotr squinted. What am I looking at? Water squinted. Water's been working at that seam for about 100 years, Tomasz said. One well-placed bore charge. Small, we're not blasting a mine face here, and about 6 tons of loose granite comes down across the road. Piotr looked at him. You can tell that just by looking. I can tell that because I've been looking at rock faces since before you were born, Tomasz said, without inflection. The charge was placed on a Sunday night in late February, packed into the seam with a hand auger and a patience that Piotr, watching, found almost meditative. Tomasz moved along the rock face with the same economy of motion he used underground. No wasted movement, no hesitation. The tools passing from hand to hand as naturally as breathing. The convoy passed on Tuesday. The charge detonated via a simple pull-wire mechanism operated by the railway engineer, Henrik, hidden in the brush 60 meters away. The rock slide blocked the road completely. No one was killed. The timing had been calculated to stop the convoy, not to bury it. The trucks were delayed for 11 hours while a German engineering crew cleared the debris. The ammunition never reached its intended depot in time for the operation it was meant to supply. The partisan group celebrated quietly. Tomasz drank 1 glass of plum brandy and went to bed. The next operation, in April, was more complex. The Germans had established a small administrative post in a requisitioned farmhouse at the edge of the village. 4 soldiers and a records clerk whose job was to maintain the labor registry, cataloging which miners worked, which shifts, and flagging absenteeism for disciplinary review. The registry was how they tracked the workforce. Without it, the whole administrative system of the mine became, at least temporarily, blind. Tomasz didn't want to destroy the farmhouse. That would invite reprisals. He wanted the registry. He spent 3 weeks observing the post routines. The clerk, a thin man in his 30s named Vogel, left the building every evening at 7 to eat at the mess hall in the next street. The 2 soldiers on evening duty played cards in the kitchen, visible through the window. The registry, a series of bound ledgers, sat on a desk in the front room, unlocked. The operation lasted 4 minutes. 2 partisans created a distraction at the far end of the street. A drunk stumbling into a German soldier, creating the kind of irritating, time-consuming nuisance that military men universally despised. The 3rd partisan, a woman named Zofia, who had once taught primary school and had the demeanor of someone utterly incapable of subterfuge, walked into the farmhouse's unlocked front door, removed the 3 most recent ledgers from the desk, tucked them under her coat, and walked back out. She passed the card-playing soldiers in the hallway. She nodded. They barely looked up. The ledgers were underground within the hour, in one of Thomas's gray roads, where Henrik photographed each page by lamplight. The disruption to the registry forced the mine administration to spend 2 weeks reconstructing their records from memory and secondary sources. During those 2 weeks, 6 men who were marked for labor reassignment, including 2 partisan members, simply didn't appear in any official document. They melted into the hills without a German pen ever noting their absence. But the summer brought harder choices. By July, the German garrison stationed at Grzybów had been reinforced. A new SS detachment arrived, not regular Wehrmacht troops, but something harder, more deliberate. Their commanding officer, an Obersturmführer whose name Tomasz learned through the partisan network, had been brought specifically to tighten security around the mine complex and root out what the German command had begun describing with evident irritation as organized local disruption. His name was Brandt. He was 29 years old. He had, according to the intelligence that reached the partisan cell through a contact at the mine's German administrative office, conducted similar pacification operations in occupied France. He was methodical. He was not reckless. He was precisely the kind of enemy that Thomas had been preparing for without quite knowing it. In August, Brandt's men arrested the schoolteacher, a quiet man named Alexander, on suspicion of partisan contact. Alexander held for 3 days before being released. He had revealed nothing, but the experience had left him shaking in ways that didn't stop. In September, a patrol stumbled close enough to one of the partisan supply caches in the eastern hills that the group had to evacuate it in a single panicked night, losing half their stored provisions. The net was tightening. Tomasz studied his hand-drawn maps by candlelight. He traced the old tunnels with his finger. He measured distances in his head, factored in support structures, calculated where the weak points were, and where a man who knew what he was doing could introduce a deliberate failure that would look, to anyone later examining the rubble, like nothing more than the inevitable surrender of old timber to old weight. The mountain had been waiting 100 years to exhale. Tomasz was going to give it a reason. The plan came together in 3 parts, the way the best plans always did. Not all at once, but an accumulation, each piece clicking into place like a support beam finding its footing. The first piece arrived when Henryk, using his railway contacts, confirmed that Brandt intended to conduct a sweep of the forested hills east of Grzybów on the night of October 14th. The sweep was designed to locate and eliminate what the Germans believed was a partisan encampment in the high ground above the tree line. They were right. There was an encampment there, or rather the remnants of one, which the group had abandoned 6 weeks earlier on Tomas's instruction, leaving behind just enough evidence of recent habitation to keep the Germans interested. 23 SS troops would participate in the sweep. Brandt himself would lead. The second piece was the Dolna Stolnia, the lower adit in the old miners' parlance. It was a lateral tunnel bored into the hillside in 1891, intended to provide an alternative evacuation route from the lower levels of the mine. It had been sealed in 1924 after a partial cave-in made it structurally suspect, and it appeared in no current German administrative records of the mine complex. The tunnel ran 340 meters into the hill before branching into 3 separate passages. 2 of those passages dead-ended in the natural rock. The third connected, through a series of low, navigable chambers, to a secondary shaft on the hill's eastern face, emerging just below the false encampment site. The German sweep, if directed properly, would enter the hill from the eastern face. Tomasz intended to make sure they had every reason to do so. The third piece was the timber. He spent 3 nights in the Dolna Stolnia with a lamp and his tools, working in the particular silence that old abandoned tunnels hold. A silence that isn't empty but dense, the compressed quiet of enclosed space and geological weight. He examined every support structure in the tunnel. He identified 7 key points where the existing timber had rotted just enough to be persuadable. He did not remove or destroy the supports. He modified them incrementally in ways that would be invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 40 years learning what a support beam looks like when it's carrying more than it can hold. He added a single coil of rope, thin, dark, strung at ankle height, across the tunnel floor at the 180-meter mark, connected to a simple release mechanism fashioned from a mine clamp and a length of wire. When the rope was pulled, the wire would transfer the tension to the clamp, which held in place the single pin that kept a small preloaded timber wedge from sliding free of its socket in the main structural beam above. That beam carried the load of 3 others. Those 3 others each carried the weight of a ceiling that had been waiting for 19 years for something to change its mind. The partisans spent the nights of October 11th and 12th making noise in the right places. Fires visible from the valley, careful tracks left in the soft ground near the eastern shaft entrance, a piece of equipment accidentally dropped and left behind near the tree line. Enough to focus Brandt's attention, enough to make the eastern approach to the hill look like the obvious direction. On the night of October 13th, Tomasz briefed the group for the last time. There were 10 of them left. Alexander had not recovered enough to participate, and 1 other member was down with fever. They sat in the farmhouse basement that served as their meeting place, around a single lamp, their breath visible in the cold. "The sweep begins tomorrow night," Tomasz said. He didn't use many words when fewer would do. "They will approach from the east. We will have people visible near the shaft entrance to draw them in. Not too visible, enough. When they enter the shaft, they will follow it naturally inward. The tunnel will funnel them. At the 188-meter mark, the lead element trips the rope." "And then?" Piotr asked. "And then they have about 40 seconds before they understand what's happening." Zofia was looking at him with an expression he'd seen before on her face, the one that wasn't quite doubt, but wasn't quite certainty either. How many will be in there when it comes down? That depends on how far they've advanced into the shaft, Tomas said. We can't control that exactly. We control the entry. We control the trigger. The rest depends on their formation. And if they're all inside, then they're all inside. No one said anything for a moment. The lamp flame moved slightly in some imperceptible draft. They were going to search those hills, Tomas said quietly. They were going to find us eventually. This is the alternative. He was not a man given to speeches. He left it at that. October 14th arrived in the way that significant days often did, ordinary until it wasn't. The afternoon was gray and cold, a low sky pressing down on the pine-covered hills. Tomas spent the daylight hours at work in the active mine, going through the motions of labor with the same impassive competence that had for 4 years made him invisible. He ate his rations in the break room. He exchanged the required words with the German shift supervisor. He descended and ascended and descended again, and the rhythm of it was so familiar that it existed almost outside time. At dusk, he left. The sweep began, according to Henrique's contact. At 8 in the evening, 23 men moving in formation up through the eastern tree line. Brandt at the center of the column. They had lamp equipment and dogs, though the dogs were of limited use in the wind that had picked up across the hill that night, carrying the smell of pine resin and damp earth. The two partisans assigned to draw the patrol, Piotr and a young woman named Basia, made themselves briefly visible near the shaft entrance at 8:40, then vanished into the trees. Visible enough to be seen, not visible enough to be caught. It was, Tomas had told Piotr, the most important performance of his life, and Piotr was to treat it accordingly. The column turned toward the shaft entrance 14 minutes later. Tomas watched from 40 meters uphill in the darkness, pressed against a rock face, his breathing slow and deliberate. He watched the first lamplight flicker at the tunnel mouth. He watched the column compress as it entered. The opening was narrow enough that they had to enter and file, one after another, the formation collapsing from a tactical spread into a single line that fed itself into the dark. He counted. 12 men inside, then 15, then 18. The lead elements were now past the 100-meter mark, pressing deeper, following the tunnel's gentle descent and the tracks that Tomas had left there earlier. Boot prints in the soft floor, a scatter of debris that looked like a recently disturbed camp. 20 men inside, 21. The 22nd man was stepping through the entrance when Tomas heard it, not felt it, not saw it, but heard it, a subsonic creak that was not the wind and not an animal, and not anything except what he knew it was, the sound of old timber taking the first syllable of a catastrophic sentence. The rope had been tripped. For exactly 4 seconds, nothing else happened. Then the Dolna Stolnia spoke. The sound was not an explosion. It was deeper than that. A long, cascading report that began as a crack and became a roar, and then became something below the range of hearing, a vibration that Tomas felt through the soles of his boots, in the palms of his hands, and in his back teeth. The hillside shivered. Dust and small stones showered from the rock face above him. The pine trees nearest to the shaft entrance swayed as though a great wind had passed through them from below. The 22nd man at the tunnel entrance was thrown backward by the pressure wave. He landed in the open air and lay still for a moment before scrambling upright. He was the last one to come out. Brand and 20 other men were still inside when the Dolna Stolnia's 3 central chambers collapsed in a progressive sequence that Tomas had calculated would take between 8 and 12 seconds from first failure to final settlement. The math had been correct. The tunnel sealed itself at multiple points simultaneously, the rotted timber giving way to the weight it had been quietly, patiently accumulating for 19 years. The noise stopped. The hillside settled. In the silence that followed, Tomas remained absolutely still for a full minute. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, he noted, with the detached part of his mind that always seemed to stay outside events and observe them, but from the physical vibration of the collapse still moving through the rock around him. Then he stood and moved. The 22nd soldier, the one who had been at the entrance, was on his feet and calling into the dark tunnel mouth by the time Tomas had circled far enough through the trees to be clear of the area. The man's voice was rising, stripped of discipline, calling names. There were no answers. The tunnel had taken everything. 3 kilometers away, in the farmhouse basement, the remaining partisan group waited. Tomas arrived at 10,017 in the evening. according to the pocket watch that Henrik had pressed into service as their timekeeper for the night. He came in from the cold and sat down without removing his coat. "Well," Fyodor said. "It held," Tomas said. "That was all he said for a while." He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the lamp, and the others let him. What had been trapped in the Dolna Estonia that night was not just men. It was 18 months of tightening surveillance, of arrested neighbors, of destroyed caches, of Marta's empty chair at a table in a house that no longer felt like a house. It was the weight of all the things the occupation had pressed down on a region until the region could no longer breathe. Tomas Robel understood, in the particular way that miners understand, that sometimes you have to let the mountain fall in order to survive what's underneath it. He didn't celebrate. He sat with the lamp, and he breathed, and he waited for morning. The Germans sealed the area around Grzybów Hill within 12 hours. A full engineering company arrived from the regional garrison, 60 men with timber, cable, and machinery. They worked for 9 days attempting to locate a viable entry point into the collapsed tunnel system. The official report, which Henrik's contact managed to photograph a partial copy of 6 weeks later, described the collapse as a catastrophic structural failure of abandoned pre-war mining infrastructure and recommended that the entire hill be reclassified as geologically unstable. The phrase sabotage appeared in the report. It appeared once, and then it was crossed out, and then it appeared again. Someone in the German command structure was not ready to accept what the evidence was clearly suggesting, because accepting it would require acknowledging that a miner with a pocketful of wedges and wire had undone 23 armed soldiers. Brandt's unit was officially designated as Vermistaum missing rather than killed for reasons that appeared to involve administrative propriety more than factual accuracy. Of the 21 men who had entered the Dolna Estonia before it collapsed, 3 were ultimately recovered alive from a partial void space near the 90-meter mark, reached after a week of careful excavation. They were taken to a field hospital and did not return to service. Their rest were not recovered. The 22nd man, the one who had been at the entrance, was debriefed at length. His testimony was, by all accounts, confused and inconsistent. He described the collapse as instantaneous. He described feeling the air pressure change before the tunnel moved. He could not explain the mechanism. He did not mention a rope because he had not been far enough inside to see it, and because what he had witnessed from the entrance had happened too quickly for the specifics to register with any clarity. No one in the German investigation found the rope. The collapse had buried it. For the partisan group, the aftermath was a strange and complicated thing. They moved immediately, dispersing to prearranged safe houses, abandoning the farmhouse basement, breaking into smaller cells of 2 and 3. It was precautionary, standard practice in anticipation of a reprisal sweep. The sweep came, as expected, in the 3 days following the collapse. Systematic searches of local homes and farms, interrogations, a general tightening of the atmosphere in the village that made the cold feel even colder. But the sweep was also, visibly, disorganized. A garrison unit conducting an operation designed and led by Brandt's detachment had suddenly lost its directing intelligence. The replacement officer who arrived from the regional command was unfamiliar with the local terrain, unfamiliar with the network of informants Brandt had been cultivating, and, most critically, operating under the psychological burden of having inherited a situation whose mechanism of failure he did not understand. 12 villagers were briefly detained. None were charged. All were released. It was not a clean outcome. There is no such thing as a clean outcome. Alexander, the schoolteacher who had been interrogated in August, was visited again during the sweep and held for a day before being released. The experience did not break him, but it left something in his eyes that had not been there before, a flatness, a careful distance from the present moment, as though a part of him was perpetually waiting for the next knock on the door. Tomas went back to work in the mine on October 17th. He descended the shaft in the early morning with his lamp and his tools, and spent 10 hours pulling coal from the earth. And no one who watched him that day would have seen anything other than a quiet, competent man doing his job. What no one saw was the thing he carried beneath the quiet. He had spent 40 years learning to listen to a mountain. He understood load-bearing and structural failure and the way weight distributes itself across a system until something gives. He had applied that understanding with precision and intention on the night of October 14th, and the result had been exactly what he had calculated. He did not regret it, but he was also not unchanged by it. There were nights, in the weeks that followed, when he would wake in the dark of his small room and lie still and listen, listening the way a miner listens when he's underground and unsure of what the rock is doing, and in the silence he would hear, or imagine he heard, the deep settled weight of the hill above the Dolnastolnia, holding everything inside it. He had given the mountain a reason to exhale. The mountain had kept what it was given. He lived with that the way he lived with everything, carefully and without complaint, and in full knowledge that the weight was real. The war ended in the spring of 1945, and Upper Silesia passed through a series of transformations that had little regard for the individuals who had survived inside them. Tomas Robel lived. He remained in Grzybów after the liberation, one of a diminishing number of men who had both worked the mine under occupation and outlasted it. The new administration, Polish now, though shaped by different foreign pressures, needed experienced miners more than it needed witnesses to uncomfortable histories, and so Tomas was put back to work, which was precisely what he would have wanted in any case. He never returned to the Dolma Stolnia. There was no practical reason to, and he was not, in general, a man who revisited things. Zofia resumed teaching. Piotr opened a repair shop. Enric worked on the railways until his retirement in 1962. Bazir married and moved east. Alexander taught for 15 years more before the doorknock caution finally receded from his eyes, or rather, became part of his face in a way that his students simply accepted as the quality of a man who had been through something and come out the other side still standing. The partisan group's activities were known in the immediate post-war years primarily to themselves. In the decade that followed, several accounts of resistance activity in the Grzybów district were collected by a regional historian named Danuta Kowalczyk, who had the discipline to interview elderly miners and the patience to sit in church halls and farmhouse kitchens and wait for old men to decide whether they trusted her. Her unpublished manuscript, running to 340 pages, documented, among many other things, the events of October 14, 1943. Drawing on testimonies from Henrik, Beja, and two individuals from the German engineering company who had been traced through post-war records. Kowalczyk described Tomas's contribution in a line that stayed with those who later read her work as not the heroism of courage, but the heroism of knowledge, the particular courage of a man who understood his world so completely that he could alter it. Tomas died in 1971 at the age of 79 in the same town where he had been born. He had been retired for 4 years. He filled the time carving furniture, precise, functional pieces, nothing ornate. He carved with the same economy of movement he had brought to everything else in his life. His granddaughter, who was 12 years old when he died, remembered him mostly for his hands, the cold dark color of them, and the way they always seemed to be measuring something invisible, calculating a load that only he could see. She didn't know what he had done in the hills above Grzybów until she was 40 years old, when she found Kowalczyk's manuscript in a regional archive. She sat with it for a long time. Then she called her mother. "Did you know?" she asked. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "He never said," her mother told her. "He just went to work." And perhaps that is the truest thing about the people who held the world together in its darkest years. Not that they were fearless, but that they were faithful. Faithful to the skills they had, to the people they loved, and to the conviction that knowledge, applied with patience and precision, could move even a mountain. The Dolnastolnia still exists beneath Grzybów Hill, sealed and forgotten, a crease in the rock that no current map marks and no current administration maintains. The hill doesn't remember, but the hill holds everything it was given, and so, quietly, does history, even when it doesn't know a name.